So I could switch session right now from being the topic that is on the slide to how to train Tibetan monks with PHP. There's some really good stories, but if you come to me afterwards, I could do word on that. So I've got a couple of slides on a different topic. Coding practices according to ExtDN. I'm actually sure that the definition in the slides or in the program guide is a little bit different. Then it's more like recommended by ExtDN. But I rephrased it according to ExtDN just to show also that this is just an opinion. However, it's an opinion that I have kind of a passion for. So let's get started. So Shannon actually already introduced me with my name. Did you pronounce it actually, or did you skip it?
I pronounced it.
Oh, you pronounced it. Oh, awesome. So the difficulty is my name is Jisse Reitsma, and I'm from the Netherlands. Being a simple Dutch boy with a couple of opinions on technology, I've done a couple of things like found Yerio, through which I develop extensions. I'm also training developers in Magento 1 in the past, but actually now Magento 2. And I've been creating Reacticon and MageTestFest. And I'm not sure if you know about it, but Reacticon is a really beautiful shirt that I wear now. And MageTestFest actually didn't have any shirts, but we're going to have shirts because MageTestFest is going to be happening again. It happened in 2017 at the end of the year in the Netherlands. But now we're actually going to Italy, Florence. So if you fancy a nice trip to beautiful Florence and actually explore also back-end testing possibilities as well, then MageTestFest is basically your thing. However, the reason why I'm standing here is ExtDN. Who did hear about ExtDN already? By raise of hands, not that many. So that's good, because I wanted to also explain a little bit like why am I standing here with a presentation on best coding practices. ExtDN stands for Extension Developer Network. And it's basically involving a couple of extension developers like myself, but also including a couple of other names like Fullman, Headworks, .mailer, Shipper HQ, and actually the list goes on and on and on. And basically what we're trying to do is get all of the extension developers out there together to lead to certain points. And some of the points are being repeated in my presentation. And how we do that is through working groups. So this is a little bit like the structure that we're trying to get to. And there's like a couple of working groups that are working on extension quality, interoperability, which is like a really long word, but it's also a really long-term project itself as well, and some communication. And what falls under extension quality is basically that we try to reduce the number of risks that you guys might have when you're installing extensions on your own shop or rolling it out for clients. That basically extensions lead to less issues, less bugs, less conflicts as well. And we're doing that in collaboration with the Magento Marketplace team. Plus, there's this PHP CodeSniffer project going on, and slowly I'm going to lead to that main point of this CodeSniffer project. The other part is interoperability, meaning that we want to have less conflicts. That's a beautiful thing always to have. But also focusing upon the expectation of features. And this is actually where it becomes a little bit more fancy. So let's say you have extension A and extension B, and you combine them, but then you're actually expecting A and B to work together in a certain feature C. So we're trying to get to the point that we're trying to predict what do people expect actually of multiple extensions working together. Including PWA, which is one of the hardest ones because we don't know where PWA is going to lead to. In that, we're also communicating with each other, with you, through presentations like these, and with Magento and Adobe on the long run as well. But that's more like the organizational structure. The goals that I wanted to get to was we need better extension quality. So if I ask a humble question to you guys, who has ever installed an extension in Magento by raise of hands? So that's like most of you. Who has gotten into issues after installing an extension? And that's the same amount of hands. So that's kind of a challenge. So as soon as you install an extension, you know that sooner or later you're going to bump into issues. But what if these issues are simply less than right now. So that's one of the goals, but then we need to talk about a lot of technical topics to get there. But in the end, that's one of the points that we're trying to get to, meaning also more happiness, because if things fail due to third-party extension, it doesn't make us happy. So I wanted to get to 8 points. And earlier in my introduction, we mentioned, like, well, I've been given training to Tibetan monks in the past on, well, various topics. So I wanted to rephrase these 8 points basically into an 8-fold path to achieve happiness. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Buddhism, but this is a little prank, but cool. The main thing is these 8 points. They're easy to understand if you're a developer. And they range from maybe the obvious to something else obvious. And one of them is basically this one, do use Composer. So how many of you are developers in the room? So that's about, well, 90% or so. Who's using Composer? So it seems really like an obvious question, right? Or an obvious point to make. If you're a developer and you're going to install extensions, you have a preference to do so through Composer. But there's more to it, and that's why I'm actually standing here on stage to explain a little bit more what is the point of coming up with such a strategy of using Composer. There's more points. Do use service contracts, referring to PHP interfaces, referring to semantic versioning of those interfaces, and that's leading to a whole different discussion on versioning as well. Testing, well, a lot of us, we believe that testing is actually a good thing to do. So again, like the number of hands, who is a developer in the room, which was like, well, now there's less hands being raised. So who's testing? Cool. So that's quite a number of hands still available, but that means actually that testing is on our agenda, but it doesn't mean that it's easy actually to implement tests. And that's one of the points to actually put it in a list of pointers. Don't forget this and that. Document your dependencies. That's something I'm going to get to. Version releases, that's semantic versioning. Provide a user manual, that's for the dummies. And use events and plugins. And then we have 8 points. Do check your code, the 8th one. So these points are sometimes obvious and sometimes even more obvious. However, the point is here, the devil is in the details. So as soon as you start focusing on one of these points, that's actually where the tough part starts. And that's actually what I'm going to do, not for all 8 points, because I only have about 10 minutes or 15 minutes left. But I'm going to do that for 3 out of the 8 points, just to show you what kind of reasoning is behind the definition. And actually, before I continue, I wanted to share also that as ExtDN, we've developed a little flyer. So you could see it as promotion, but it's actually promotion to increase extension quality overall. So all of these 8 points are actually documented on a flyer. I've brought a couple of them with me here, but later on you can also go to the Magento booth, and I've dumped a couple of them right there as well. Because each point comes with a full-on description. So this description reads, use Composer packages to distribute, especially commercial extensions. For a local environment, it's fine to develop your own code under app/code. However, once you distribute your module to other environments, it should be through Composer, as otherwise dependencies are left unmanaged. In a production environment, the app/code folder should therefore ideally be empty. So it reads like a full paragraph. However, I sat down with a couple of the members of ExtDN, and we spent literally 2 hours on this phrasing. And why? Well, the devil is in the detail. So I'm going to pick out a couple of these points to show like what is going on actually here, what makes it more difficult. Well, the first part starts really easy, use Composer. However, what we've added in between is especially for commercial extensions. And then if I ask again, like how many of you have installed extensions, then there's a certain number. And then if I ask like how many of you have installed commercial extensions through Composer, then it suddenly fails. And that's weird. Because actually we've turned it around, especially when you're relying on somebody else, and especially when there's a price involved. It should be that Composer is the standard. And if the composer is not a standard, it shows basically that the extension provider is sloppy, is lacking managing its own dependencies in a way that the developer actually wants to manage it. So it's not a debate anymore, it's the standard. And that's actually what we're trying to do with ExtDN. We're trying to push the standards to increase extension quality. So it's not a debate, it's a base requirement. This is the first part of this rule about do use composer. But then it continues on with locally, you can use app/code. And as a developer, you know this. You can add your own code to app/code, and then you have a module there, or theoretically a theme as well. But then we say, well, yes, that's true. But as soon as you're deploying, composer should be used. And this actually leads to a conflict in the rule itself. So the difficulty is how can you now develop something in app/code while you actually deploy that same code through composer? Well, it's an ideal scenario, but why do we focus upon composer so heavily? Because as soon as you develop your own code, that code has dependencies. And that's the point of the second point coming up after this one as well. But these dependencies include the framework of Magento, they include PHP, they include other modules of the Magento core. And as soon as one of those dependencies fails, it doesn't matter whether it's your own code in app/code or whether it's a third-party extension developer that has published some code. You want to make sure that those dependencies don't lead into issues. And that's why we're using Composer. We're not using Composer just for the fun of typing in Composer require. No, we're using it to track dependencies. And especially under app/code, we add PHP code that always has dependencies with Magento. In the description itself, or maybe in one of the other points, it comes forward that a module always has dependencies with another Magento module or the framework. And if a module doesn't have any dependencies, it's not a Magento module, it's a Magento library or a generic PHP library. And that's why we say, ideally, in production, app/code should actually be empty, leading to the fact that actually Composer is used for all of the code. So hopefully this shows actually that it's a little bit more complicated than we initially think. Just using Composer, that's nice, but using Composer all the time, that's actually when it becomes a little bit tougher. Okay, moving on. I'm skipping point 2 and 3. Point 4 is interesting for this presentation as well. Do document your dependencies. Again, it starts with a whole story, but I'll skip the story for now. It basically focuses upon if you have a module, and this module has dependencies, document it in your own code. And how do we document it? Well, for instance, in module.xml. And this might be a sample of a dummy module. However, this dummy module might have a couple of dependencies, for instance, with the catalog. So as soon as I'm reusing code of the catalog in my own module, I should actually reflect upon that using this XML code. But further on, why am I actually doing something with the catalog? Well, maybe because I'm hooking into the backend to do something with products or categories. So as soon as I have a dependency with showing something in the front end or in the backend, I also have a dependency with the backend module. Likewise, in the backend, I might be able to add XML UI components, a grid, a form, or something similar. And as soon as I do that, I have a dependency with the UI module. And actually, almost every module that is doing something in either the backend or the front end always has a dependency with the store module as well, because the store module is actually used to run the web shop of Magento through the pages, so through HTTP. So it leads quickly to more and more modules that also should be reflected in the Composer file. So normally, whatever you see in the module.xml file should also be reflected upon in the composer.json, plus, well, whatever dependencies are there in Composer itself, so the framework, PHP, etc. And to do this again right, it's much, much harder than you initially think. So this is a sample, and it's a dummy sample. I'm totally sure that actually the versions that I wrote down here are totally wrong. but it's just to illustrate the point. There could be a dependency with the backend module of a specific version, but then the catalog module, a completely different version. And you, as an extension developer, you need to track down what are my dependencies. Because if I don't do that properly, Magento might introduce a new feature, and then suddenly my module breaks. So I'm leaving the whole discussion on version management. I'm moving onwards to the 8th point. Do check your code. Who's using some kind of code validation tool on a regular basis? Well, maybe I need to rephrase it a little bit. I'm coming up with a couple of examples, but the rule itself says, well, use a static analysis tool like PHP CodeSniffer. And I started off with my whole slide saying, like, I'm going to focus on one thing more specifically, and that's CodeSniffer. So here we go. But there's multiple ways of guaranteeing your code actually works. It could be that you have a simple script that turns the whole shop into the production mode and then simply checks whether your extension is still working. It could be that you're checking out your own extension under multiple Magento versions, but you have to check it somehow, because not checking your code at all means you're being sloppy. You're not testing like the basic functionality of it. So to elaborate on this a little bit, PHP CodeSniffer is a project that allows a static analysis of all of your PHP code. However, then the biggest question is, what kind of rule sets do you apply? It could be the generic PHP standards like PSR1, PSR2. Magento has developed 2 times a different project, and now the extension quality program actually leads up to EQP2 with an improved version of all of their tooling. ExtDN, we also developed a couple of rules, and then there's other stuff like object calisthenics. And I'll get back to this in a minute or so. But the important thing is basically to realize there's CodeSniffer rule sets that allow to be really in detail, allowing you to check upon certain code quality standards. But then the biggest question might be which one to follow. And that's something I hope to answer in a couple of slides from this. But just to finish off, what is checking your code? You could use different tools like PHP Stan, GrumPHP, the security advisories, linting itself, testing itself, and etc. But it doesn't stop just with automated tools. It could also be kind of like a social interaction with others, code reviews, extension reviews, pair programming, hackathons. It's just a way to seek the help of others, automated or from a person-to-person basis, to make sure that whatever you create makes sense. But it's hard. Magento itself has created in the past 2 projects that were there to help us, the developers, actually create CodeSniffer rules to actually check whether our own code was actually validating in the proper way. And we found them to be lacking. Sometimes the ECG standards were outdated, or the EQP standards were applying to maybe more Magento code or extensions on the marketplace, but not any kind of extensions. So extensions on GitHub might be behaving in a different way, or might lead to different results or different quality standards. And that's why we came up with an ExtDN PHP CodeSniffer project. And the obvious thing would be for me to ask you guys, please help us make this thing work. We're looking for active contributions, but actually that's not the only thing. We actually want this repository to disappear. We want it to be obsolete because of actually Magento incorporating the same rules that we do, leading also to the fact that we as a community, we need to interact actually with Magento so that the rule set that Magento applies on the Magento core or extensions or your own code actually makes sense to us all. So in the end, what we're trying to do is make sure that actually the code is checked by Magento, by tools that we can contribute to, and etc. And actually that's work underway. So Magento EQP2 is part of the effort of Magento to create a CodeSniffer project that actually is actually open for contributions on the long run. But in between, this ExtDN repository might be a good way of dealing with things. So one of the quotes, oh sorry, One of the quotes that I came up with was, well, instead of just complaining about extensions and extension quality, what we should do is make our hands dirty, make sure that we go out of our way just to make sure that our extensions or third-party extensions are living up to better standards. And the only way actually to do that is to participate in whatever is going on in the community. And I hope that my little example of ExtDN shows that at least there's a couple of initiatives out there to improve this whole thing. And that was my main point. Stop complaining, start contributing. Thanks.
It doesn't get more perfect than that. All right, we've got time for a couple of questions out here. Who would like to ask?
Yeah.
First.
So, as an agency working mainly with client sites and not necessarily distributable extensions, using Composer for everything what we've seen is it can create a whole lot of repositories and get really messy with version control. Do you have any recommendations on how to solve those problems and kind of make it cleaner as far as version control for those projects go?
Well, to the point, no. So the main issue is actually as soon as you're bumping into like code offered by an extension developer and that extension developer is not offering any version control, any kind of Composer standards as well, then basically you're left in the dark because then you have to do all of the version management yourself. And actually a lot of agencies are doing this. So they're trying to pick up on the code of somebody else and then trying to convert it into a Composer package while they try to make sense out of the versioning standard. But as soon as the original developer doesn't make use of Composer, my belief is also that they're not using semantic versioning properly as well. And that's basically one of the issues. So what I'm slowly trying to do together with ExtDN as well, we're trying to lead to better standards, awareness among merchants, local developers, but as well extension providers, and that we're in the end hopefully trying to push the message towards those extension providers that are not living up to it. And that's part of the ExtDN effort that we're trying to get to.
Yep, hi. First of all, thank you for a great presentation. It's always a pleasure to see your presentations, and it's great that you're trying to deliver this part of your work to Magento AQP. But my question is, what the main differences or main changes in the rule sets that you have which does not exist in the AQP? So what's the principal difference?
Well, so it's a generic question that you're asking, and that's the difficulty because the devil is in the details. You really have to dive in. But in general, I think the thing that we got to was a lot of times actually the rules of Magento about plugins, for instance, and then the around method in the plugins is different than the rules that we want to apply to it. And in the end, the rules themselves could be equal to all, but then the warning levels are actually the way maybe to identify, like, okay, the warning level for Magento is really high, so that they're living up to the highest standards. But then extension providers a lower level, and then who else wants to use it, maybe a lower level than that. But hopefully the same amount of rules apply. But the difficulty is not only that we have Magento extension providers and well, users, but we also have the difficulty of versions. So we came up with, for instance, a rule that deprecates block classes in favor of view models, but that's only a 2.2 feature, so that deprecates basically all of the code of 2.1. And should we push that, or should it be an alternative rule set? Or so it's part of the discussion that we're not sure about yet, but I think the discussion is already nice to have.